Hello, and welcome to the 13th chapter of our unit on Greek and Roman mythology. Today we are going to be reading the story of Io. The portrait of Juno in Roman mythology, just like that of her Greek counterpart Hera, is one of an extremely jealous goddess who knows about her husband's philandering ways and does everything she can to discourage him. Jupiter, the king of all the gods, whom the Greeks called Zeus, fears his wife's wrath, but he still sneaks away to earth on occasion to frolic with the nymphs and mortal maidens. The story of Io is just one of several tales that deal with these entanglements and divine deceptions. And without further ado, the story of Io. In a certain part of Greece there was a beautiful grove, bordered on all sides by denser woods. Through it there flowed a restless river, dashing over rocks and scattering its spray like fine mist over all the trees on its banks. The god of the river, Inachus, had one child, a girl named Io, and there was nothing she liked better than to wander in the grove by the side of her father's stream. One day, when mighty Jupiter had come down to earth to wander through this pleasant grove himself, he met Io there and began to talk with her. Now Io was a beautiful and graceful nymph, and Jupiter thought her so lovely that he came again and again to the grove and spent many pleasant hours wandering with her along the banks of the stream. Io did not know who Jupiter was, for he always came disguised as a shepherd lad, but she found him to be a pleasant companion, and it must be said that she was as much attracted to him as he was to her. This friendship was not without its complications, however, for Jupiter's wife, Juno, was a very jealous queen, and in truth it must be said that Jupiter's interest in the young beauties of earth gave her much cause for concern. Juno, you see, could not bear to have Jupiter care for any other woman more than herself. One day, when her husband had been away from home for many hours, Juno suddenly made up her mind to go down to earth and see the maiden that was occupying so much of Jupiter's time and attention. Her heart was filled with bitter feelings, and as she entered the grove, her frown was so dark that it seemed almost to hide the sunlight. Jupiter was in the midst of a long embrace with his dear Io when, with a mystical power that only gods have, he felt Juno's wrath before she even came into the grove. Fearing that she would surely do some harm to his companion, he quickly changed Io into a young cow, a sleek white heifer. When Juno came down to the side of the river, all that she saw was her husband in his own true form, and the white heifer nibbling the grass at his side. Now Juno knew that the animal was really Io, for she was wise to her husband's tricks, but she pretended that all was as it appeared to be. She went up beside the animal and stroked its glossy neck, and then turning to Jupiter, she said, "Even though this is but a lowly heifer, it gives me much pleasure. Will you give it to me, my husband, as a present? For surely a cow cannot mean much to the great Jupiter, and I do wish it for my own." Well, what could Jupiter do? If he refused his wife such an insignificant gift, she would surely guess what had happened, and so he had to say yes, although it was much against his will. As Juno led Io away, she said to herself, "Now that I have you, I will take good care to see that you never go near my husband again." So she gave the cow to one of her servants, Argus, for him to watch over, and there was no better watchman than Argus, for he had 100 eyes, and no matter how tired he became, he never closed more than half of his 100 eyes at any one time. So there were always at least 50 sharp eyes watching every move that Io made, day and night. Never for a moment was Io left unguarded. At night she was tied to a tree, but during the day she could wander about as she pleased, still though under the keen gaze of Argus. The poor girl did not quite know what happened to her. One minute she was a pretty maiden, and the next she had become a cow. Instead of the food to which she was accustomed, She had to eat leaves and grass. She slept on the cold, hard ground instead of in her cozy bed, and she drank not from a cup, but right out of the running brooks. When she tried to stretch forth her arms to ask Argus for pity, she found, to her surprise, that she had no arms, and instead of the plaintive words she meant to speak, she heard only a strange lowing sound come out of her lips. This frightened her terribly, but when she went to the banks of the river where she had so often walked with Jupiter before, she was even more terrified to see her own image reflected in the water, horns and all. The water nymphs who used to be her friends did not recognize her, and even her father, the river god, only patted her neck and plucked some fresh grass to feed her. Oh, how sad could it be not to have her own father know her! She could not speak to him, but with her hoof she inscribed her story in the sandy river bank. When he read the sad tale, her father wept aloud, and throwing his arms about his daughter's neck, he poured out his grief in tears. Meanwhile Argus faithfully kept watch, and he saw all that had passed between father and daughter. He now thought it time to separate them, so he led the heifer away to a distant pasture, and seated himself on the top of the hill, from which he could see all that happened in the pasture below. Now mighty Jupiter had not forgotten Io, and he knew well that it was only because of his attentions and the jealousy of his wife that the girl was being punished. So he wished to help her if he possibly could, and he called his messenger Mercury to come to him, and he ordered Mercury to use all his cunning in finding a way to kill the 100-eyed beast who was watching over the girl. Mercury flew swiftly to earth, and there he put on the disguise of a shepherd boy, and pretended to be gathering stray sheep that crossed his path. When he came near the hill where Argus sat watching, he began to play sweet melodies on a pipe of hollow reeds that he carried with him. When Argus heard the sounds of the pipe, he was pleased, and he called out to Mercury, "Come here, stranger, and share this shady spot with me. Your sheep can feed in the rich pasture, and you can rest your weary feet." Mercury then seated himself on the hillside, and tried to put Argus to sleep by talking on and on in a wearying tone, stopping only to play some restful music on his pipe. This went on for a long time, but the watchman would never close more than half his 100 eyes. Still Mercury persisted, relating a long and tragic story about how the pipe of reeds came into being, and telling it in a soft and sleepy manner. When the tale was finished, Mercury saw, to his delight, that Argus was sound asleep. Every eye was closed. Mercury quickly unsheathed the short sword he carried with him, and with one swift stroke he cut off the head with its 100 starry eyes, and there it lay beside the watchman's body. Mercury quickly returned to Olympus, but before Jupiter could make his way to earth to change Io back to her true form, Queen Juno happened by the pasture and saw the tragedy that had befallen her watchman. Oh, she did grieve so over Argus's lifeless form, for he had been her favorite, and to honor him she removed his eyes and set them in the tail of her favorite bird, the peacock, where you may see them shining in splendor to this day. But the queen blamed poor Io for all this trouble, and, to punish her, sent a large gadfly to torment her, night and day, biting and stinging the poor girl, until Io was beside herself in pain. She wandered from one country to another, trying in vain to rid herself of the gadfly. At last she came to the land of Egypt, where, tired and weary from her long travels, she lay down beside the side of the Nile River, and tried with her groans and pitiful cries to ask the gods to relieve her suffering. Jupiter could no longer bear to see her tormented so, and he begged Juno to take pity on Io, and he promised never again to speak to the maiden if only the queen would set her free. Juno herself was moved with pity, and so decided to restore Io to her own shape. The people of the land found her by the side of the river Nile, and they thought her so beautiful and good that they made her their queen. And there she lived happily for many years, and when at last she died, the people carved a great statue of their queen and placed it in a magnificent temple. They called the statue Isis, and for hundreds of years the people of Egypt came and laid flowers and other gifts at the feet of the statue of Isis to show how much they loved their beautiful queen. Hope you enjoyed the reading of the story of Io. A few words more. The word that the Romans would have used to show how Io traced her story in the sand was scribo, which means to write. It is from that root that we get many modern English words that have to do with writing. Inscribe, scribble, describe, prescribe, scripture, and many others. The Greeks, on the other hand, used the word grapheme. We also see that root in many common English words that have to do with writing or drawing, such as photography, which means to write with light, geography, to write about the earth, telegraph, to write from afar, and pencils write with graphite. Up next, we will be reading the story of Halcyon's dream. Join us then.